You had Biden last week saying we're facing the risk of Armageddon. How is that not the top story?
Go, Saxy-Poo, go take it.
All right, here we go. Let me just cue it up for Sax.
Biden last week said we're facing risk of Armageddon. That's your tee up.
Okay, here we go.
And then Leon Panetta let's tee it up, J. Cal. Everyone knows what's going on. Then you have Leon Panetta, who was the former Secretary of Defense and Director of Central Intelligence, wrote an op-ed for Politico saying that intelligence analysts have now raised the probability of a use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine from 1 to 5% at the beginning of the war to 20 to 25% now, is what he says. So, and I don't think he'd be saying that if this wasn't pretty much conventional wisdom in Washington now. I mean, Panetta is sort of a very respectable figure in the Beltway.
And so Biden said it, right? For the first time 2 weeks ago.
Biden said that we're facing the most dangerous situation and the highest risk of nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. He called it the risk of Armageddon. The problem is that nobody is willing to say what we should be doing differently to avoid this situation. So, people are always attacking us for having a point of view on foreign policy. First of all, this affects us. I don't know why we're not allowed to have a point of view. But, in our business thinking, where there's an existential issue, you have the attitude of drop everything and figure this out. If somebody told you that there's a 25% chance of your company blowing up, maybe in the next few weeks, you would drop everything and focus on that problem. But it's like, after the Armageddon comments, it's like the media just passed over it. It's like, oh, this is like crazy Biden or whatever. It was minimized. It was contextualized. The White House walked it back. Nobody's really focusing on this and what we should be doing differently. And in fact, what Panetta recommends, and Petraeus said the same thing, is that if Russia uses a attack nuke in Ukraine, then we should respond by attacking Russia directly. Now, if we do that, we are literally in World War III. And remember, at the beginning of the war, Biden was really clear that we weren't going to get directly involved. He vetoed the idea correctly of the no-fly zone, which would have required us to shoot down Russian planes. Biden, remember, he was asked in the press conference at the beginning of the war by Lester Holt. Holt said, Mr. President, what if Americans are trapped behind enemy lines in Ukraine? Would you send in American troops to go get them? Biden said no. I think very properly said no, because he said, listen, we do not want to risk World War III. But now, because of mission creep and a slippery slope, and we've all gotten more involved in this war, we've gotten more emotionally committed, you now have Panetta and Petraeus calling for us to directly attack Russia and get in World War III. The Russians almost certainly would respond with nuclear because that's all they've got. They don't have the conventional forces to stand up to us. So look at how close we have now gotten to the brink of a nuclear showdown. And has anybody reassessed? Is anyone calling for us to reevaluate? Because that's the conversation we should be having right now.
And Freeberg, this brings up 2 points that I think you can comment on. Naval, actually, the founder of AngelList, angel investor, and just public thinker, I would say public intellectual, he came on to call in with the two of you, and he, outlined like who does get to have an opinion on Ukraine and other issues, which has dovetailed with this, like who gets to be an expert in the world today. And of course, at the same time, not only Sachs has been commenting on, hey, what's the off-ramp here? Elon has been talking about, hey, how do we get out of this? Do we have some votes, by these regions that have been annexed or that are in dispute? AOC now is getting criticized. I don't know if you saw people shouting her down at a public event today or yesterday that she's a warmonger and she won't speak out against war. How do you frame the public dialogue about this, Freeberg? And then do you see a potential off-ramp here other than Putin leaves Russia, which is, I think, the public stance by a lot of folks? Putin can end this. He just has to leave Ukraine in order for this to end. So 2 questions there for you, Freeberg.
It's very hard to have good dialogue about any situation where an argument could be made on the grounds of morality in an absolute sense, making it really difficult to have a discourse around what the right thing to do is, because you don't agree fundamentally on the objective you're shooting for. One side says the objective is to preserve the integrity of democracy and the freedom of people. And the other side says the objective should be to secure the interests of the West and the United States and preserve the world from nuclear holocaust. I think that's what makes this a challenging conversation. The objective can be reframed, and then from that objective, each side can make their own case without being forced to take in the point of view of the other side. And it's why we're at a bit of a standstill, and it's also why it's so easy to get swept up in a mass point of view, a coalesced point of view of the masses that makes one feel good about what may end up being a very bad situation. It feels good to say, I'm doing this for freedom of the people. I'm doing this to save lives. And at the end of the day, it may cause a nuclear war. And it's okay because I feel good going into this debate that this is the right thing. It's the morally superior thing to do. What's very hard is that we can't actually say, as a group, our objective should be to preserve the integrity of democracies around the world to an extent. And that's a nuanced point of view. To an extent means I'm willing to preserve the democracies through certain actions, but I'm not willing to cross a certain line. And absolutism doesn't need to come into play. That's what I think is making this such a very difficult conversation. And it's why it's so hard to actually have a conversation around it. And it's really, I would argue, the most poignant and the most dramatic moment in what we talked about earlier, which is this deep-seated kind of, bipolarity. And once you're sitting on your pole, you don't want to come off. And you don't realize that so much of the dialogue is in this middle. And we have to come to some point of view that maybe this isn't about an absolute outcome. It's not absolutely going to be nuclear war. And it's not absolutely going to be the end of democracy. There's some conversation in the middle that's very difficult to have. And people that work somewhere in the world, hopefully, ambassadors, foreign policy people, State Department people, hopefully are having the more nuanced, critical conversation about how do we resolve to the maximal outcome that doesn't necessarily take us to an absolute end.
Chamath, to that point, it's going to be an imperfect outcome here.
I think this is much, much simpler than all of this. Leon Panetta is a senior counselor to this defense contracting agency called Beacon Global Strategies, who works on behalf of Raytheon. I found that out while Friedberg was talking in a 2-second Google search. I suspect that if you looked for Petraeus's conflicts of interest, you would find that through some Byzantine set of, strategic consulting organizations and whatnot, he also works on behalf of the defense industry. So you have these people who will generate more revenue and more profit if there is a massive war. And those people have been trying to push us into a land war in Europe since this whole thing started. And so this is just yet another attempt. It's just the most final way of doing it. So I would just encourage people, whenever you see all these folks clamoring for war, is just to keep in mind that they are riddled with conflict and that you can find it out. Again, this information is sitting in plain sight on the internet, and you can figure out whether this person is really advocating a truth that makes sense, or they're getting paid to shill a revenue-generating mechanism for some part of the military-industrial complex.
Sachs, how much of this is people talking their book being the military-industrial complex in your mind?
I think that's a big part of it. I think all of these Washington think tanks are funded by defense contractors. I think it's short-sighted, obviously, because if it leads to a nuclear war, there's not going to be a defense industry. There won't be anything left. So, but look, I think that Washington is wired for war in part because there's a huge lobby for it, for all these defense contractors. And what's the lobby for peace? I mean, there's no one really arguing for peace.
Speaking of this, Elon.
No, I'll tell you what's lobbying for peace. And I'm going to connect what may seem two disparate ideas together. But the single biggest thing I think that will prevent nuclear war is the inflation that we're feeling. And the reason is because it allows the Fed, in my opinion, for the first time really in the last 15 years, to act properly. And if they hold the line and they take interest rates to 4 or 5%, I think one non-obvious outcome of all of that is that it becomes extremely expensive, next to impossible, to finance military adventurism abroad. And that's a practical economic outcrop of really, meaningfully high rates greater than zero. And so I actually think the reality is that for a lot of these governments, the more that inflation sticks around, the stickier it is, the higher rates are in general, the bigger the problems at home are, and the less prone they're going to be likely. I actually think that explains the escalation of this rhetoric, because people want to try to make this issue and put it on the table. But you understand that, these folks don't say it's a 90% likelihood. They go from 1% to 25%, which, if you understand probabilities, is effectively a left tail risk that's effectively the same. And the reason they're trying to do it is they're trying to get it back, David, as you say, to timestamp it, to get it in front of people's perspectives, to make it important in a moment where everybody increasingly, not just in the United States, but in the UK, in Europe, are looking internally and trying to figure out how to keep their economies in a reasonably functioning way and how to make sure that their financial and other infrastructure keeps working.
So you're saying...
And that is not necessarily a priority when rates are zero. But when rates are 4%, I mean, just by the way, if you guys saw what happened today, it was the competing of two narratives this week. There was the financial narrative of the UK having to bail out their pension system, right? Of all of a sudden the pensions being forced sellers, of those forced sellers now spilling into the United States debt markets around CLOs and collateralized loan obligations and junk debt, which then could theoretically spill as a contagion into other parts of the market. That was narrative one. And all of that, by the way, is a result of hiding inflation and the Fed moving up rates and other countries being forced to attack inflation with higher rates and creating all these dislocations. Narrative one. Versus narrative two, which is, hey, all of a sudden we have to put the nuclear risk on the table. And if you actually saw the print that was spilled, the disproportionate amount of the rhetoric actually focused on the former narrative and not the latter. And so I think that that's why these folks are escalating the rhetoric in order to kind of create an equality so that they get enough print on that version of the outcome.
What you're saying is you have the world saying, we can't afford to have this conflict. We are broke. We've got too many chaotic issues.
I think the world is saying we are increasingly under enormous domestic pressure. And as a result, we cannot spend on things abroad.
We can't afford this. And then the other side saying, well, we need you to afford this, so nuclear is going to happen. There's going to be a nuclear annihilation.
Then there's a small strain.
Pay more attention to this.
There's a small strain of folks who would economically benefit and who are now ratcheting up their rhetoric so that second path becomes more and more on the table.
What do you think of this, Freeberg, this analysis that Chamath has? These two polar, these two groups vying for the attention and/or budget of the world.
The military-industrial complex?
Versus, citizens saying, our country can't afford this. We need to focus inward.
Not citizens, the central banks.
Okay, but I think the central bank's influenced by citizens, right? Like, this is a system here we're talking about. People are, watching their pensions go away. They're watching jobs get cut.
If I was a betting man, I would guess that the next $500 billion to $1 trillion that is spent in Western world economies will be to subsidize something that's broken internally inside of one of our countries, whether it's the UK pension system or whether it's the high yield credit markets, and it will not be to finance military adventurism in Russia.
People,
just to underscore that point. So there's an article today in the Washington Post about how the U.S. government's debt service is going to be around $570 billion this year, which is a 45% increase. Biden's budget for 2023 is only $1.6 trillion. So you're talking about something like over a third now of the official budget is already going to debt service.
Because it's on variable, right? It's a variable rate.
Yeah, exactly. Because so much of it is it's not locked in long-term rates. So because interest rates have gone up so much, the debt service gone up, and interest rates are still going up. And so, Druckenmiller had those points around how the debt service is within a decade is going to eat up practically the whole federal budget. So Chamath is right that we've never really had to choose between guns and butter before in the past. It was just, let's just do both and we'll rack up more national debt. I do think there will be more and more pressure to question this type of spending and why we've already given Ukraine $80 billion in handouts when we can't afford to basically pay for, major entitlements at home. So I think there'll be more pressure. Now, I don't know if that pressure is going to come in time, though, to de-escalate this Ukraine war. It's not. And that's what concerns me. And just to cut to the chase on this, I think where the rubber meets the road on Ukraine is Crimea. And why? Because the Russians have a major naval base there at Sevastopol. It's the home of the Black Sea Fleet. And they will never give that up. They are willing to use nukes, I believe, to basically protect that asset. It's a vital interest of theirs. Hold on. 80% of the population of Crimea, they're Russian, and 3/4 of them, according to polling that was done by Gallup and by a German polling firm, so not Russian polls, indicated that they see themselves as Russian and want to be part of Russia. So if we supported self-determination, we'd be fine with Crimea being part of Russia. But here's the rub. Ukrainian nationalism demands that every square inch of Crimea goes back to Ukraine. And it is State Department policy right now that we will never recognize Crimea as being Russian. We'll never recognize the annexation, which happened back in 2014. So something's got to give here. Something's got to give. Either we have to sit down, Zelensky, and say to him, listen, you're not getting back Crimea. We're going to make that part of a peace deal. Or we are going to back the Ukrainians in their military effort to retake Crimea with the result that I think is quite likely that the Russians will be willing to use a tactical nuke to prevent their total defeat. So at some point, we're going to have to choose here. Which of these outcomes do you want? Do you want to basically go for a negotiated settlement, which means telling the Ukrainians they cannot have everything they want? Or do you really want to risk a nuclear war to take back Crimea, which is Russian, and the people there see themselves as Russian? So we need to make a choice here.
Yeah. So Elon put out a tweet and got savaged for it. And he outlined sort of what you're saying here. So do you think his plan, he said, redo elections of annexed regions under UN supervision, Russia leaves if that is the will of the people. And then he says Crimea, formerly part of Russia, as it's been since 1783, water supply to Crimea assured. As you're saying, Ukraine remains neutral. Should the West force Ukraine to accept these type of terms, essentially elections, and I don't know why Crimea wouldn't be part of that election process, do you think UN supervised elections in those regions should occur, and we should force Zelensky to do that? Sachs?
He who pays the piper calls the tune. Of course, we need to have a point of view on how this war should be resolved.
Should we force him to do that?
Listen, it's not about force. They can fight on and do whatever they want as long as they want. Hold on, without American weapons.
That's what I just said.
Without American weapons.
So you think he should do that? We should pull the American weapons if he doesn't. Yeah.
If Zelensky wants our weapons and support, which appear to be infinite, we should not give him a blank check guarantee. The blank check is what started World War I. The German Kaiser gave Austria a blank check guarantee, and it led to World War I. That is how great powers get pulled into the wars of minor powers. And we absolutely have to have a point of view on how we do not get pulled into this. And I think one of our lines should be that we are not going to fund the Ukrainians in retaking Crimea.
Got it. So just to clear this so we can move on to the next topic, you're in support of not giving further weapons support to the Ukraine unless they negotiate this.
It's not going to come to that. We need to have a point of view on how this war gets resolved. But you are in support of that, stopping our support if they don't sit down and negotiate a settlement here. That's what you would do. America needs to have a point of view of what is in its own interest. What is in our interest is for this to get resolved diplomatically at some point through a negotiated settlement, not for it to escalate into a nuclear war that we could get pulled into. The only way that's going to happen, is if Crimea goes back to Russia. I'm telling you, they will be willing to pull out all the stops. And by the way, they could even use TAC nukes before Crimea. But
can you answer the question, though, that I asked 3 times? Would you remove American support in weapons if they don't accept that? If Ukraine doesn't accept that, would you be comfortable taking away our support in weapons?
I don't think it's going to come to that, but yes, we should be willing to threaten that.
Okay, that's it. I'm just trying to get you to answer that one question.
Hold on a second. They are a client state of the U.S. They do not call the shots. We're America. We call the shots. We're the big dog here.
All right.
That's the bottom line.
All right.
And you really want to get pulled into a nuclear war? Because
I do not. I just wanted you to answer that one question. We should pull our weapons if they don't.
Let's get real.
Okay,
this is about our future. You know, we are American nationalists, at least I am. I'm not a Ukrainian nationalist. I support self-rule. I think we accomplished something by preventing Kiev from getting toppled, but I want to support self-rule for the people of Crimea.
It's time for a settlement in Sax's mind.
I think the most important thing that we can all be thankful for, which I think will prevent a lot of wars in the next 10 or 20 years, is inflation and non-zero interest rates. It's just going to be really tough. Like,
I love both for example,
the UK cannot do anything right now other than make sure that they have foreign currency reserves to back up the pound, which they don't really have that much. They're going to need money to bail out their pension system. Whoever thought it was a good idea to allow pensions to run levered risk it's obviously insane. Could you imagine if it turned out that the teachers' pensions and the firefighters' pensions in America were running levered long? I mean,
they are.
They're not.
This has to get resolved now. I mean, it's just we're at a breaking point.
No.
Yeah, it's clear.
You know what a pension is?
I know. I'm not trying some fancy.
It's just a debt instrument.
No. I'm saying.
That's all it is.
I'm saying don't use some fancy intellectual argument. I'm saying practically speaking, the treasurer is not allowed to call Goldman Sachs and say, I'm going to run 2 turns of leverage on this money. That is not allowed to happen in the United States. Okay. I get in some fancy way it could be thought of as levered long with, all kinds of indirection, but that is not how the world works today, practically speaking. It is how the UK works. A treasurer in a UK pension system is allowed to call an investment bank and actually run levered. That is insane. Okay. So my point is when rates are non-zero, all of that jig is up. Governments are forced to batten down the hatches and, husband cash for God knows what will break in the system. And I think that is, and as disruptive as that is, it may actually be the bulwark against war.
The jig is up, folks. I think that's what we should take away from this is we can't afford this, and the United States is funding it. We have to force a settlement here, and it will be a profile of courage.
And that may be the silver lining of inflation.